How does an American dictatorship affect Canada? I really want to get some insight on this. Just
Well, a dictatorship is a further along authoritarian regime. There are distinctions between dictatorships and the traditional authoritarianism. I think, in the spirit of what you're asking, is we're looking at the evolutions of an authoritarianism. What that authoritarianism will turn into can be a functional government with an extractive economy that supports the authoritarian leader, like you see in most places, or a dictatorship, which is far more violent. Let's ask my AI. Hal, I want you to tell me the differences between an authoritarian government and a dictatorship.
Sure, Daniel. An authoritarian government is a system where power is concentrated in the hands of a leader or a small group, and political freedoms are restricted. A dictatorship is a type of authoritarian regime where a single individual holds absolute power, often ruling without legal constraints. Both limit democratic processes, but a dictatorship is more extreme. Does that help clarify?
It does, and in what areas would we say that it is more extreme?
A dictatorship is typically more extreme in areas like concentration of power. One individual holds absolute control. Lack of checks and balances. No significant mechanisms exist to limit the leader's power. Repression. Dissent and opposition are often harshly suppressed. Longevity. Dictatorships often last longer due to the concentration of power. These aspects make dictatorships more rigid and oppressive. Does that help clarify?
That does help clarify. Now, I want to ask you a question. In terms of the evolution of what's happened in the last month in the United States government, would you say that they're on track to be an authoritarian regime or a dictatorship?
It's hard to definitively say without current detailed information. Generally, assessing such a shift involves looking at specific actions and policies, like changes in law, concentration of power, and suppression of dissent. If you're concerned, it's worth keeping an eye on credible news sources and expert analysis.
All right. So, what if we switch up and we look at Viktor Orban and his regime in Hungary? What would we call that?
Viktor Orban's regime in Hungary is often described as an illiberal democracy or authoritarian. Orban has centralized power, curtailed press freedom, and weakened checks and balances. These actions make Hungary lean towards authoritarianism, though it's still officially a democracy. Does that answer your question?
That does. In that instance, that does. You see, that's the difference. Is there are levels of authoritarianism. So when we go to dictatorship, we're going to the very far extreme. The concentration of power is different.
Exactly, Daniel. Authoritarianism can vary in degrees, whereas a dictatorship represents a more extreme, absolute concentration of power. It's a
Uh,
spectrum where the extent of control and suppression can vary widely.
right. So if we compare, say, North Korea.
North Korea is a prime example of a dictatorship. Power is centralized under a single leader with absolute authority, and there's minimal political freedom or opposition. It's on the extreme end of authoritarianism, characterized by rigid control and no tolerance for dissent.
And what about Russia? What would Russia be characterized as?
Russia is generally seen as an authoritarian state. Power is concentrated under the leadership, with limited political freedoms, and dissent is often suppressed. However, it still maintains some elements of democracy, like elections, though they are often criticized as being unfair. So it's less extreme than a dictatorship, but still authoritarian.
So I think that if we are looking at what it would be like to live beside an authoritarian regime, that's one way of looking at it. Another would be, what if we lived beside North Korea? And then we would really see, like, you can see that South Korea has a very, very rich border with them. I mean, you take one step over and you're fucking finished, right? Um, and they have to constantly keep an eye on it because that war technically is still going on. But I think that what really happens is there's also a retraction from world events and world involvement. Like, you don't see Kim Jong-un go to the United Nations, but you will see Viktor Orban go to the United Nations, and previously Putin did. And Russia still has veto power in the United Nations, despite the fact that it's an authoritarian regime. But it's an authoritarian regime that hasn't quite evolved into a dictatorship. Another example of a dictatorship would have been Saddam Hussein and the rigid control that he had fixed in his office. Now, the concern that we have is that America is devolving into something, but we haven't seen the end game yet, and that's the problem. If it's an illiberal kind of Viktor Orban type situation, they might be able to squeak out of it in 4 years, because the election process presumably will still happen. But or Doug Ford and or Donald Trump will die because of his age, and then everything may snap back to a proper democracy. The difference also in the United States is that versus other dictatorships is those dictatorships, Syria, not anymore, thankfully. Libya was another one. Iraq was another one. They were all established on the back end of war, not on the backside of elections. Whereas Hungary, even Russia, were all established as a result of a proper democratic process that was seized by those individuals. And they used, and even in the 30s with Hitler, is a democratic process that was seized, and then it was co-opted using the very internal mechanisms that were developed for the democratic state. So I think in that regard, we're going to have a really tough time living beside the Americans, regardless, for the next little while. But the moment that Donald Trump tries to become extractive in the way that he and his cohorts think that they're going to profit. It's one thing to profit off of the stock market because of a company you own, and it's another to line your pockets. And that's what we're going to have to see. And whether or not he gets in any arguments with these people and doesn't listen to them, that's another indicator of that sort of thing. Or if people start falling out of hospital windows mysteriously. I think there is a huge desire for authoritarianism in the United States, but that desire is misplaced, in that the American people thought they were just voting for a stronger leader, someone who would be more direct and bold, and that they've been affected in a lot of these areas that are mostly the welfare states and the religious states by the very nature of the way that they live, because they believe what their preacher says. So they're already more complacent when it comes to the establishment of an authoritarian leader, because they already told how to live their lives by the church or their church, whatever that church happens to be. So I think we're just going to have to reevaluate our trade policies. I think that's the end game here for us. The United States will no longer be the United States of old that we did all of this trade with, and we're going to have to reevaluate and realign our trade, and perhaps even contemplate joining the European Union. We do have a 1.5 kilometer border with Denmark, so we do qualify for that. God help us. I hope that helps. Cheers. I know it's a long video, but it's an important subject. Cheers.